They weren't just generals. They were nightmares in uniform. To the Nazis, these 25 men weren't names on a map. They were storm fronts, ghost stories, and unsolvable problems. From the freezing steppes of the East to the burning skies over Germany, each one rewrote the rules of war and made the Third Reich bleed. Some fought with tanks, others with silence. All of them were feared, deeply, viscerally, and not always for the reasons you'd expect. This isn't a story of heroes. It's a story of who the Nazis hated to fight, and why they never forgot them. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, especially if you like your history with a touch of mystery and a side of dread. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? We want to know who's out there unraveling the past with us. 1. George S. Patton. The Germans didn't just fear George S. Patton. They studied him, obsessively. They tracked his movements the way a gambler tracks loaded dice, fully convinced that wherever Patton showed up, disaster followed. And they weren't entirely wrong. From the German perspective, Patton was their mirror. Flamboyant, ruthless, a believer in momentum over caution, and armored columns over committee meetings. They didn't just fear his army, they feared the idea of him. Even when he wasn't actually leading a force, they assumed he was. The entire German 15th Army waited anxiously in the Pas de Calais for a D-Day landing that never came, paralyzed by a phantom army the Allies crafted from cardboard tanks and fake radio signals because they believed Patton was in charge of it. That wasn't deception. That was weaponized reputation. But it wasn't just theater. When the Allies broke out from Normandy in Operation Cobra, it was Patton's Third Army that tore through the hedgerows like a pack of wolves. French roads clogged with retreating Germans. Panzer divisions were rolled up before they could reposition. Patton was what happened when a blunt instrument learned to think in spirals, and yet, for all his fire and fury, Patton wasn't the most methodical killer of the Reich. That honor belonged to a very different kind of field marshal, one who never moved until he had mathematically guaranteed the outcome. 2. Bernard Law, Montgomery. In the German playbook, Bernard Montgomery wasn't exciting. He was inevitable. If Patton was fire, Monty was gravity. You didn't see the fall until you were already on the ground, wondering how it happened. Rommel once dismissed Montgomery as a plodding bureaucrat. That changed after El Alamein. There, Montgomery unleashed a slow-motion demolition of the Africa Corps, a crushing logistical steamroll where every shell, every fuel truck, every spare tank had already been arranged in rows behind him, like dominoes waiting to fall. The Germans called it a material Schlacht, a battle of material, not maneuver, and they hated it, because it meant their tactical genius, the very soul of Blitzkrieg, no longer mattered. Montgomery didn't fight battles. He built inevitabilities. He made war less like chess and more like accounting, cold, relentless, and totally immune to battlefield flair. His style didn't inspire fear in the moment. It induced dread over time. Because once he started moving, he didn't stop until the enemy broke or vanished. Montgomery was the sound of boots in the mud before dawn, the quiet roar of tanks on the horizon, the numbing knowledge that there was no improvisation that could save you. But the Germans weren't just afraid of what came after Montgomery. They remembered the man who came before him. While the Germans were busy recalculating their odds, you might want to do the smart thing they never did. Prepare ahead. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And while you're at it, tell us, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Always curious who's out there wandering through history with us, especially at strange hours. 3. Claude Auchinleck. Erwin Rommel respected very few of his enemies. Claude Auchinleck was one of them. Before the polished mythos of Montgomery, there was the Auch, a reserved, cerebral general who preferred results over rhetoric. When Rommel's Africa Corps rampaged through North Africa in 1942, it was Auchinleck, not Monty, who stood in the way at the First Battle of El Alamein, and held, barely, but he held. What shook the Germans was not the size of Auchinleck's forces or the brilliance of his maneuvers. It was the improvisation. The British Eighth Army was fractured, retreating, outgunned. But Auchinleck imposed steel on the chaos. He rotated divisions with clockwork precision. He patched holes with Indian and Australian troops who'd been mauled weeks earlier. And he did it without waiting for reinforcements from London. Rommel, who thrived on disorder, suddenly found himself in a deadlock, and he hated it. He called Auchinleck a clever and tough opponent, which in Rommel speak was basically an admission of defeat. But even Auchinleck, with his quiet grit, wasn't prepared for what came next. A shift in the war that would move from the sand-blasted deserts to the blackened skies of the Reich, where fear didn't arrive on tanks. It fell from above. 4. Arthur Bomber Harris. To the Nazi propaganda machine, he was a monster. To Albert Speer and the German industrial elite, he was a mathematical extinction event. And to the average Luftwaffe officer? Arthur Harris was a logistical apocalypse in a tweed coat. He didn't fight battles in the conventional sense. He didn't capture cities. He erased them. As commander of RAF Bomber Command, Harris didn't just believe in air superiority, he believed in air inevitability. And he made that belief felt nightly. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Each city became a morbid equation. Population density multiplied by flammable architecture, divided by the number of bombers the RAF could send in waves. To the German High Command, he was an unpredictable kind of terror. Because he didn't care about tactical value or military targets. He cared about breaking morale. Industry, infrastructure. The German war effort wasn't defeated in the forests of the Ardennes. It was starved in the wreckage of synthetic oil plants and shattered railway junctions. But as the Reich looked skyward for answers, it missed what was happening at ground level. Because while Harris shattered cities from above, someone else had begun dismantling the German war machine at its most vulnerable joint, its fuel supply. 5. Karl Spaatz. Karl Spaatz didn't drop bombs to make a point. He dropped bombs to make the enemy immobile. While Arthur Harris turned the air war into a nightmare, Spaatz turned it into a chessboard, with every refinery and fuel depot another pawn taken off the table. The Germans were slow to realize what was happening. At first, the American bombing campaign looked like a copy of the British one. Loud, dramatic, and erratic. But then came the oil campaign, the real one. Spearheaded by Spaatz and his methodical brain trust, it wasn't about terror. It was about precision. Ploiești, Leuna, Bolin. Synthetic fuel plants deep inside the Reich. Plants the Germans had staked their armored future on. Spaatz went for them all. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's chief of fighters, admitted after the war that it was this campaign, not D-Day, not the Eastern Front, that truly grounded the German Air Force. No fuel meant no planes, no tanks, no retreat, no counterattack. And worst of all, no illusion of control. It was quiet devastation. But it wasn't quiet for long. Because as the Luftwaffe crumbled, the German generals braced for something more primitive, more American, and far more brutal. The thunder of artillery, steel, and raw momentum. 6. Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley didn't shout. He didn't wear ivory-handled pistols or issue threats into cameras. What he did instead was bury entire German divisions under synchronized bombardment, quietly, methodically, and without blinking. To the Wehrmacht, Bradley wasn't colorful. He was unavoidable. The Germans called Patton a slasher. They called Bradley an architect of annihilation. And when Operation Cobra opened with a rolling wave of carpet bombing that turned the elite Panzerlehr division into wreckage and craters, even the most jaded German officers understood. Tactics no longer mattered. Firepower did. Bradley was the engineer behind that shift. He didn't invent the tools, bombers, tanks, artillery barrages, but he stacked them like bricks into walls the Germans couldn't climb. He turned mobility into math. He didn't maneuver around German lines. He erased them. And when he advanced, it wasn't with flourish. It was with saturation. Panzer commanders in Normandy reported a chilling new feeling: irrelevance. Their training, their experience, their doctrine, it no longer worked. The enemy had stopped playing the same game. And yet, amidst the deafening crescendo of mechanized firepower, a quieter threat was taking shape. A new kind of mind, subtle, innovative, and utterly unpredictable, was about to take the battlefield. One that wouldn't fight the way anyone expected. 7. Guy Simonds. The Germans didn't fear Guy Simonds because he was loud. They feared him because he was weird. Not eccentric weird, doctrine weird. The kind of commander who looked at established rules of war, nodded politely, and then quietly dismantled them in the dark. In Normandy, German SS officers like Kurt Meyer began noticing something unsettling. Canadian formations under Simonds didn't behave like British units, or American ones. They attacked at night. They moved infantry inside armored hulls. They advanced under artificial moonlight, giant searchlights bouncing light off cloud cover to create an eerie, ghostly glow that robbed defenders of shadows and certainty. German after-action reports described the sensation as fighting an enemy that had rewritten the timetable. Simonds understood something crucial. German defenses were built on prediction, on knowing how the enemy should behave, so he made sure they didn't. His invention of the Kangaroo, armored personnel carriers created from converted tanks, solved one of the Allies' deadliest problems: how to keep infantry alive while crossing open ground under machine gun fire. The Germans had no counter ready. Their doctrines assumed exposed infantry. Simonds removed exposure entirely. At the Scheldt, his operations dismantled fortress defenses the Germans believed would hold indefinitely. Not through brute force, but through controlled chaos. His attacks felt asymmetric, unbalanced, and deeply uncomfortable to defend against. And while Simonds unsettled German tacticians in the lowlands, a very different kind of fear was growing farther south. Among mountains the Germans had declared impassable, and an enemy who simply refused to accept that label. 8. Alphonse Juin. The Germans trusted maps. Alphonse Juin did not. In Italy, German commanders fortified the Gustav Line with absolute confidence. Rivers, cliffs, ridges, natural barriers layered with concrete and artillery. The terrain itself was supposed to be the defense. Juin looked at it and saw pathways. Commanding the French Expeditionary Corps, Juin unleashed troops the Germans deeply misunderstood: Moroccan Goumiers. Lightly equipped, fast-moving, and utterly comfortable in mountains, the Wehrmacht had written off as militarily irrelevant. While American and British units stalled in frontal assaults, Juin's forces slipped through ravines, goat paths, and ridgelines that didn't exist on German operational maps. Field Marshal Kesselring noticed immediately. His reports describe a new danger, not from tanks or bombers, but from men appearing where no enemy was supposed to be. Defensive positions were outflanked not by force, but by geography itself turning traitor. The psychological impact was severe. German soldiers weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting the collapse of certainty. Positions once considered safe were suddenly vulnerable. Retreats turned chaotic. Carefully prepared lines dissolved into improvised withdrawals. Juin didn't defeat the Gustav Line alone, but he cracked its logic. And once that logic broke, the entire Italian defense became a slow-motion unraveling. Still, someone had to coordinate the chaos that followed. Someone who could hold together Americans, British, French, Poles, and others without letting the alliance fracture under pressure. The Germans knew him well, and feared what he represented. 9. Harold Alexander. Harold Alexander didn't look dangerous. And that, to the Germans, was the most dangerous thing about him. Polite. soft-spoken, impeccably calm. He gave no fiery speeches, no dramatic ultimatums. Yet Field Marshal Kesselring considered him one of the most threatening Allied commanders of the war, not because of his tactics, but because of his control. Alexander commanded coalitions, and coalitions are supposed to fail. Different languages, different egos, different priorities. The German High Command counted on that friction the way gamblers count on gravity. Alexander denied them the payoff. In North Africa, then Italy, he orchestrated multinational forces with unsettling smoothness. Disagreements were absorbed, rivalries diffused. When others clashed, Alexander mediated. When others hesitated, he delegated. To the Germans, it felt like fighting not an army, but a machine that refused to jam. Kesselring's nightmare wasn't Alexander's attacks, it was Alexander's patience. German counteroffensives found no weak seams, no political fractures to exploit, no sudden Allied collapse. Just pressure, constant, polite, suffocating pressure. Alexander didn't need brilliance in every subordinate. He needed cohesion. And he got it. Again and again. Which left the Germans with a grim realization. Even if they survived the desert, the mountains, and the beaches, the war was becoming something else entirely. A war where the sky itself would become a battlefield, and mercy would be calculated in tonnage. 10. Philippe Leclerc. To the Germans, Philippe Leclerc was not just another Allied general. He was a memory that refused to stay buried. France, defeated, occupied, humiliated, was supposed to be a closed chapter. Leclerc turned it into an unresolved threat with an engine. His 2nd Armored Division moved with a speed and aggression that felt uncomfortably familiar to German officers. Too familiar. They had used this style themselves in 1940. Now it was coming back at them, sharpened by resentment and driven by something far more dangerous than doctrine: purpose. Leclerc didn't just advance, he surged. His columns ignored tidy timelines and pressed forward whenever opportunity appeared, forcing German units into constant reactive retreats. The liberation of Paris was more than symbolic. It was psychological warfare. German commanders understood symbols. They knew morale could collapse faster than supply lines. Seeing French armor roll into the capital shattered the carefully maintained illusion that the Western Front was merely an Anglo-American affair. France was back, and it was angry. Then came the dash to Strasbourg, fulfilling Leclerc's oath to liberate the city. German defenders expected pauses. He gave them none. His tempo denied them the one thing retreating armies need: time to think. But speed alone wasn't the Allies' only weapon. In the Mediterranean, the Germans faced a commander who combined speed with adaptability, landing where least expected and refusing to be boxed in by terrain or tradition. 11. Lucian Truscott. Lucian Truscott was the kind of general German officers respected without ever quite understanding why. There was nothing theatrical about him. No grand speeches, no cultivated legend, just results that appeared inconveniently often in places the Germans believed were under control. At Anzio, where Allied forces were supposed to be trapped and slowly crushed, Truscott reorganized chaos into momentum. German intelligence noted something unsettling. Units under his command reacted faster than expected. They moved quicker, counterattacked sooner, and recovered from setbacks with unnerving efficiency. This wasn't recklessness. It was muscle memory. Truscott mastered an unusual combination: amphibious warfare and mountain fighting. Where most generals excelled at one, he treated both as variations of the same problem: movement under pressure. In southern France, his forces surged inland with a confidence that suggested rehearsal rather than improvisation, forcing German formations into fragmented withdrawals instead of orderly retreats. To German field officers, Truscott represented a new American type, not raw, not clumsy, not dependent on overwhelming odds. He was adaptable, persistent, quietly lethal. And yet, for all his discipline and control, Truscott's troops rarely fought with the raw emotional charge the Germans would soon encounter in Italy, where an army arrived carrying not just weapons, but a history of betrayal, loss, and unfinished vengeance. 12. Wladyslaw Anders. German soldiers at Monte Cassino learned very quickly that the Polish II Corps did not fight like other Allied formations. They fought like men with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. And at the center of that storm stood Wladyslaw Anders. To the Germans, Anders' troops were unsettling not because of their equipment, but because of their mindset. These were men who had survived occupation, imprisonment, displacement. They did not see the battlefield as a career or an assignment. They saw it as reckoning. German paratroopers defending Cassino noted that Polish attacks came with an intensity that ignored conventional thresholds of exhaustion. Anders himself understood this dangerous fuel and used it carefully. He didn't waste it. He focused it. When the Poles finally took the heights above Cassino, it wasn't just a tactical victory, it was psychological shock. Positions held against multiple Allied assaults fell to an army driven by memory rather than momentum. German commanders recognized the danger immediately. These were not troops who could be intimidated by fire or stalled by casualties. They advanced because stopping meant accepting a past they refused to live with. And as the Germans absorbed this reality in Italy, a far greater nightmare was already forming to the east, one led by a man whose arrival alone signaled catastrophe. 13. Leslie Morshead. In 1941, when the German Africa Corps was carving its legend into desert sand, a problem emerged at a place called Tobruk. That problem's name was Major General Leslie Morshead. The Germans expected Tobruk to fall quickly. Rommel himself did. The math was simple: superior tanks, momentum, shock value. What they didn't count on was the psychological algebra of the Australian 9th Division under Morshead. His men didn't behave like a besieged force. They behaved like a trapped predator. Morshead didn't sit back and wait. He launched constant patrols, harassed German supply lines, and treated the defensive perimeter like a forward operating base. Rommel called him a devil commander, not because Morshead broke the rules, but because he refused to play by expectations. Tobruk was supposed to be a footnote. Morshead turned it into a fortress that bent German timelines and burned their resources. It was the first time Blitzkrieg met something it couldn't crack in motion. Morshead didn't just hold a line. He humiliated the myth of German invincibility at its peak. And once that myth cracked, the entire balance in North Africa began to shift. But in the east, a far less fragile kind of force was building, one that didn't crack myths. It steamrolled them. 14. Georgy Zhukov. To the average German soldier, there were only a few words worse than "Zhukov is coming." By 1943, his name was shorthand for catastrophe. Zhukov didn't lead battles. He authored annihilations. He didn't dabble in counterattacks. He designed them to end entire army groups. To the Wehrmacht, he was the Red Army incarnate, remorseless, methodical, and terrifyingly consistent. The man never lost a major operation. Not one. At Stalingrad, his plan encircled the German Sixth Army in a pocket so perfect it could have been drawn with a compass. At Leningrad, he bled the enemy dry. At Berlin, he smashed the gates of the capital with the inevitability of an avalanche. What made Zhukov truly fearsome wasn't just his numbers, it was his use of them. He coordinated millions as if maneuvering a single unit. Every Soviet push under his command carried a whisper of doom. German commanders didn't fear surprise with Zhukov. They feared confirmation. His arrival in a sector meant it was already too late. The offensive wasn't coming, it had already begun. But even among the Soviet elite, Zhukov wasn't considered the most elegant strategist. That title went to someone else, someone quieter, and perhaps even more dangerous. 15. Konstantin Rokossovsky. If Zhukov was the hammer, Rokossovsky was the scalpel, cold, calculated, and deeply respected by the very Germans he defeated. His operations didn't just work, they humiliated. Operation Bagration was the prime example, a deceptive masterstroke that obliterated Army Group Center, the very heart of the German Eastern Front. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a disappearance. Divisions ceased to exist, maps had to be redrawn from scratch, and the Germans never saw it coming. What made Rokossovsky exceptional wasn't just the outcome, it was the design. He orchestrated dual breakthroughs, concealed his intent until the last moment, and exploited terrain the Germans believed was impassable. His finesse terrified them. They could understand brute force. They could brace for it. But how do you defend against someone who makes your doctrine irrelevant? Unlike many Soviet commanders, Rokossovsky didn't lean on attrition. He weaponized deception. German generals noted how his offensives unfolded like stage plays, each movement deliberate, each feint meaningful, each collapse inevitable. And just when the Wehrmacht thought they'd found the rhythm of Soviet strategy, a new figure arrived on the battlefield, one who didn't slice or smash, but encircled, then closed the trap, relentlessly. 16. Ivan Konev. To the German generals facing him, Ivan Konev was a slow realization that you weren't going to make it out. He didn't just beat you. He outflanked, encircled, and erased your options before you even realized they were gone. He was the architect of collapse. Konev specialized in turning hope into a trap. His signature move? Letting German forces believe they could still maneuver, then cutting off every escape route in a single sweep. The Korsun-Shevchenkovsky offensive was a textbook example. German units thought they were repositioning. Konev made sure they were walking into a cauldron. When they tried to break out, the Red Army was already waiting. He didn't rely on brute force alone. He coordinated armor, artillery, and infantry with such speed that German staffs couldn't keep up with the changes in their own front lines. And when Konev closed a pocket, he didn't leave a back door. He left a wall. There's a reason he was chosen to race Zhukov to Berlin. It wasn't just rivalry, it was trust. Stalin trusted Konev to finish things. But while Konev closed jaws, one Soviet commander worked at the level of inches, turning the brutal intimacy of urban combat into a psychological weapon. 17. Vasily Chuikov. To the Germans trapped in the meat grinder of Stalingrad, Vasily Chuikov was the general you couldn't shake. He wasn't across the river. He wasn't behind the lines. He was right there, in the rubble, in the sewers, in the shadow of your own bunker. Chuikov's genius wasn't scale. It was proximity. He pioneered a form of warfare that neutered German air power and artillery. Get so close to the enemy that they couldn't use either without hitting themselves. This was the tactic of hugging the enemy, and it turned the Wehrmacht's strongest advantages into liabilities. His defenders dug in not just physically but psychologically. German soldiers described the unnerving sensation of fighting an enemy that refused to disengage, even when logic demanded retreat. Chuikov's 62nd Army was exhausted, under-equipped, and yet utterly immovable. They didn't hold Stalingrad, they inhabited it. The Germans tried to bomb him out. They failed. Tried to starve him out. Failed again. He responded by dragging them deeper into a ruined cityscape they no longer understood or controlled. And just when they thought the Soviets couldn't escalate further, tanks began closing in from the flanks, led by a commander who believed in one thing above all: close the distance and fire. 18. Pavel Rotmistrov. In the German playbook, Tigers and Panthers weren't just tanks. They were the backbone of battlefield dominance. But then came Kursk, and with it, Pavel Rotmistrov. As commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, Rotmistrov faced the spearhead of Germany's armored elite at Prokhorovka, one of the largest tank battles in history. And instead of playing defense, he did the unthinkable. He charged them. At close range. Through the dust, the smoke, and the wreckage. Rotmistrov knew the limitations of German armor. Their optics and guns were superior, but only at range. So he closed the gap. Soviet tanks took massive losses, but they got close enough to turn the fight into a slugfest. Tiger tanks lost their advantage. Maneuver gave way to chaos. The battlefield turned into a scrapyard of burning steel and brutal reversals. To the Germans, this wasn't just reckless. It was unsettlingly effective. Rotmistrov didn't win through elegance. He won through commitment. The kind that said, "We know we'll bleed, but you'll bleed more." Kursk shattered the illusion that German armor was untouchable. And yet, while Rotmistrov broke tanks, another Soviet general was breaking the commanders behind them by keeping them guessing until the last second. 19. Nikolai Vatutin. To Field Marshal von Manstein, arguably the most respected strategist in the German High Command, there was one Soviet commander he couldn't pin down, predict, or outmaneuver. That man was Nikolai Vatutin. Vatutin didn't come at you in straight lines. He came at you sideways, indirectly, and always sooner than expected. He was the kind of general who understood that disruption was a weapon in itself. During the Third Battle of Kharkov, Vatutin's aggressive maneuvers forced Manstein to spend more time reacting than planning. And in the liberation of Kiev, Vatutin launched a surprise offensive across the Dnieper that caught German intelligence flat-footed, again. To the Germans, Vatutin was maddening because he refused to behave like a Soviet general. He didn't lean on massed waves or brute pressure. He used deception, feints, and tactical risk in ways the Red Army was not supposed to excel at. His battlefield fingerprints were subtle until they weren't. And just when German field officers thought they could adapt to Soviet flexibility, another name began appearing in their briefings. A tank commander whose strength wasn't shock or speed, but how he turned defense into destruction. 20. Mikhail Katukov. Mikhail Katukov wasn't interested in glory charges or sweeping offensives. What made him dangerous was that he preferred to wait. And while most Soviet commanders were known for hammering German lines with relentless pressure, Katukov flipped the script. He ambushed. At the Battle of Moscow, Katukov's tank brigade was one of the first Soviet formations to prove that panzers could bleed. And not just bleed, fail. His crews didn't charge across open ground. They concealed themselves in forests, villages, snowbanks, waiting until the German advance exposed its flanks. Then they struck with precision. No bravado, just mathematics. German reports after those early encounters were laced with confusion. These Soviet tankers weren't reckless. They were disciplined. And worse, coordinated. Katukov's style introduced a chilling concept. Soviet units could now anticipate, counter, and adapt. By Kursk, Katukov commanded the 1st Guards Tank Army, and his defensive layout was a nightmare of depth, deception, and deliberate killing zones. German panzer divisions ran headfirst into his trap and didn't come back out. But while Katukov made panzers think twice, another Soviet name began spreading unease, not for his tactics alone, but for how quickly he brought the war home to German soil. 21. Ivan Chernyakhovsky. When Ivan Chernyakhovsky was promoted to lead an entire front at the age of 37, the Germans assumed it was a political stunt, until he started dismantling East Prussia. Chernyakhovsky wasn't just the youngest Soviet front commander. He was also one of the most dangerous. His forces didn't grind forward like traditional Soviet offensives. They surged, with speed, coordination, and terrifying momentum. German lines in the Baltics and eastern Poland found themselves overwhelmed before they could properly react. Retreats turned into routes. In 1944, he became the first Soviet general to cross into German territory proper. That mattered, not just tactically, but symbolically. The German homeland had been an abstract line for years, something to be defended but never truly touched. Chernyakhovsky shattered that illusion, and he did it fast. The panic this caused in the German civilian and military psyche can't be overstated. Reports of Soviet tanks and infantry breaching into East Prussia led to mass evacuations, rushed reinforcements, and a growing sense that no part of the Reich was safe anymore. But even as German commanders scrambled to reinforce their front lines, new kinds of enemies were emerging far from the conventional battlefields, figures who didn't need tanks to bring entire regions to their knees. 22. Josip Broz. Tito. He didn't have tanks. He didn't have air cover. Half the time he barely had ammunition. But to the Germans occupying Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito was one of the most frustrating enemies they ever faced, because he simply wouldn't die. Tito wasn't a battlefield general in the traditional sense. He was a phantom, a walking contradiction, charismatic, ruthless, impossible to corner, and always just far enough ahead to escape every trap. From the German point of view, this was the nightmare scenario. An enemy leader who commanded no conventional army but tied down more Axis divisions than were fighting in Italy. Operation Russelsprung was supposed to be the end of him, a full-scale airborne assault meant to decapitate the Yugoslav partisan leadership in one bold stroke. Instead, it failed. Tito slipped through their grasp again, vanishing into the mountains. His survival wasn't just frustrating, it was demoralizing. Every German officer stationed in the Balkans had the same unspoken thought: we should be somewhere else. And while Tito waged war with terrain and ghosts, the Germans found their grip slipping in another domain they once dominated: at sea, where a quiet naval commander was about to make their Mediterranean plans obsolete. 23. Andrew Cunningham. The German war machine wasn't built for the sea. It relied on the idea that someone else would hold the waves. That someone was supposed to be the Italian Navy. But then Andrew Cunningham happened. He wasn't loud. He didn't court fame. He just won, repeatedly. As commander of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, Cunningham made it his mission to break the Axis at sea before they could ever build momentum on land. At Taranto, he pulled off a nighttime aerial assault using slow-moving biplanes that crippled the Italian fleet in port. It was the kind of operation the Germans hadn't considered possible. The Japanese studied it. The Allies were amazed by it. And the Germans? They were suddenly forced to compensate for an ally whose navy now mostly sat at the bottom of a harbor. Cunningham's dominance at Cape Matapan followed the same pattern: deceptive movements, nighttime aggression, and the systematic dismantling of Axis naval confidence. After that, the Germans began transferring air and U-boat support to the region, just to cover for the losses. But naval battles were still battles. What came next was something entirely different. A new kind of warfare that rewrote how the Germans thought about logistics, supply lines, and safety behind the front. 24. Orde Wingate. If the Germans feared conventional Allied commanders for their tanks and air support, they feared Orde Wingate for his ideas. Because Wingate didn't just fight the enemy, he ignored the entire structure of conventional warfare. Operating mostly in Burma, far from the European theater, Wingate nonetheless terrified German planners. Why? Because his methods, long-range penetration, air-dropped resupply, behind-the-line sabotage, began to spread. The concept of the Chindits, his specially trained jungle units, reached German ears not as folklore, but as warning. Wingate proved that with air supply and mobile units, deep operations could be launched into enemy rear areas indefinitely. And if it could be done in Burma, why not France? Why not the Rhineland? The idea shattered the German illusion of a safe rear. Rail depots, supply convoys, communication hubs, they were all suddenly vulnerable in ways static defenses couldn't protect. The psychological impact rippled far beyond his jungle operations. His tactics influenced airborne operations in Europe, inspired unconventional raids, and shifted Allied strategic thinking toward flexibility and depth. Which brings us to one final figure, less celebrated than Patton, less feared than Zhukov, yet still a ghost in German war rooms. Because he didn't talk big, didn't move fast, he just advanced, relentlessly. 25. Jacob Devers. Jacob Devers didn't crave the spotlight, and maybe that's exactly why the Germans underestimated him until it was far too late. There were no flamboyant press briefings, no oversized ego, no headline-grabbing declarations, just steady forward motion. And to the Wehrmacht in late 1944, that was the worst kind of threat, a general who advanced without drama, without delay, and without stopping. Devers commanded the U.S. 6th Army Group, pushing up from southern France in a theater the Germans expected to hold longer. They didn't. His forces moved fast through the Rhone Valley, shattered resistance in the Vosges Mountains, a terrain German officers considered a natural fortress, and did what few believed possible, crossed the Rhine at a point the enemy thought untouchable. He didn't wait for orders. He seized opportunity. In the Colmar pocket, where the Germans dug in for a last-ditch defense of Alsace, Devers coordinated French and American forces in a grind that turned into collapse. His tempo disrupted the German southern flank entirely. It wasn't glamorous, but it was catastrophic. Exactly the kind of erosion that eats an army from the edges inward. And just like that, the war's ending wasn't just visible. It was inevitable. But the fear the Germans felt wasn't just about the generals who fought them. It was about the ones they never truly understood, and the war they were losing not just on the battlefield, but in the mirror.